The poor doctor saved the duke's daughter, but the nobility ordered him to be executed. Hello? Tell me where you are watching this video from. Write in the comments. I'm really interested to hear your story. Enjoy listening. Life in the town beneath the gray walls of the duke's castle was cramped and anxious. The autumn was damp, the wells smelled of slime, and the noise in the markets did not hide the emptiness of people's wallets. On the outskirts of town, a small house nestled near the smithy. There lived Luke, a thin boy with hands that always smelled of vinegar and herbs. His mother used to wash laundry for the monastery, and taught her son to look not at the shine, but at the meaning. He was used to taking on the burden of other people's misfortunes, as if carrying water in 2 buckets, carefully and to the end. That year, a black plague swept through the town. People fell as if they had stumbled in time. Doctors in cloaks jostled in the square. They placed expensive jars on tables, whispered foreign words, and asked for so much silver that it took the breath away from the poor. Luca carried water mixed with vinegar, taught people to boil rags, made them take straw out into the light and burn it, explaining that warm air in a cramped room made the trouble worse. They replied that he was not from the workshop or from the scholars, but he just took on the next bowl, the next wound, the next family. When the disease reached the castle, alarm replaced routine. In the Duchess's chambers lay young Adele, her only daughter. Her skin burned like glass in a stove, and her breathing was labored. The court physicians said that they had to wait for a sign from heaven, that they had to dissolve gold in vinegar, that they had to hold the smoke of incense to her head until the headache went away. The old women of the town whispered that it was a punishment. The servants were most afraid because fear has swift feet, and the life of a faithful servant is short. At noon, a cart loaded with furs, ribbons, and boxes drove into the courtyard. It was a gift from a wealthy man from a distant city, connected to the court through conscience and trade. Sitting in the cart was the manager Sigismund, thin, smiling, with eyes that were always calculating, even when he pretended to admire a flower. He hugged a box with a foreign seal, promising that it contained a relic from a monastery on a high bank, and assuring everyone that such a thing preserved fragile youth. He said he would be able to arrange the necessary acquaintances if the trouble became too loud. The floor in the courtyard was wet, and boots were reflected on it, just as promises are reflected in the eyes of people accustomed to bargaining. Adele's condition worsened. One of the laundresses remembered Luca. Her name was Tessa. She was the daughter of the town executioner, and had grown up under suspicious glances. She had once seen Luca at the laundry. He had helped her carry the baskets and silently placed a silver coin in her palm when she didn't have enough money for bread. Tessa plucked up her courage and told the manager that there was a boy in town who was not afraid of disease and knew how to keep things as clean as a whistle. The manager smiled, said that the Duke had his own doctors and the town's poor had their own fairy tales, and turned away. A servant of the old school, who remembered different times, whispered to the Duchess that there was hope, but hope without a name does not come. The Duke ordered Luca to be summoned, because when his daughter's breath falters, it is easier to shake off the dust of ancient rules. Luca came to the castle without bowing and without unnecessary words. He washed his hands in vinegar, tied up his sleeves, demanded that the curtains be untied, and ordered the windows to be opened, even though it was cold in the rooms. He ordered the straw and curtains to be taken out, the things to be piled up in a large heap and burned in the courtyard. He asked for water, garlic, juniper branches, and clean fabrics, simple ones without embroidery. He said he would not leave incense because the smell should come from purity, not smoke. The courtiers frowned. Sigismund sighed especially loudly because he liked it when everything was connected through signs and seals, not through simple actions. Luca listened to Adele's chest for a long time, as one listens to the sound of a river at night. He found inflammation, an abscess on the sole of her foot, and looked away so as not to betray his alarm. He knew that many died when the hand trembled. He warmed the needle over the coals, wiped it with wine vinegar, waited until Adele's breathing became more even, and did what was necessary. By evening, the fever had subsided. He ordered everyone to keep quiet, change the water, and remove the new gloves with a delicate scent from the girl's hands, which were lying on the table next to the box, wrapped in white cloth. He said that the scent irritated her breathing and got into the wound like an annoying guest. He noticed that the gloves made her skin itch. He ordered them to be taken to the barn until further investigation. The servants saw the Duke's eyes clear for the first time that day. In the evening, Tessa brought Luca a bowl of soup. He ate in silence. She said that in the morning she had seen Sigismund near the box with the gloves, and that he had ordered no one to approach it. Luca just nodded. He often listened silently and drew conclusions later, when he could put 3 or 4 facts together and see the connection between them. At night, the castle breathed with drafts. The executioner, Oscar, Tessa's father, sat in the gatehouse. He rarely spoke, but everything was organized in his head. He saw the manager walk with a candlestick to where the box stood and return empty-handed, with a patient expression on his face. Oscar was used to noticing small details because that was his job. If you missed a thread, the knot would later choke you. The next morning there was a murmur in the market. They said that the poor doctor had done what the rich had not dared to do. They said that he pricked people with needles like a sorcerer, that he burned curtains like a thief. Some claimed that he had brought the disease from the slums. Others recalled that he always carried a wooden medallion with a faded coat of arms, and whispered that he was a child of sin. Luca had carried the medallion ever since he was found as a baby at the monastery door. The medallion bore a barely visible mark resembling a cross with a lily. An old brother at the monastery once told Luke that such a mark was placed on the belongings of children who had no one to speak for them except God, and those whose conscience still remained intact. Adele's condition stabilized. Luke imposed a quarantine on the castle, forbade unnecessary visits, and ordered everyone to wash their hands and boil knives in bowls. He expelled those who came for show rather than for business from the chambers. He said that extra eyes stole warmth and strength. The courtiers were outraged. They said that he was breaking with tradition, that he was not in the guild, and had not sworn allegiance to the city. The steward, Sigismund, sent notes to influential people, writing that dangerous insolence had come to the castle, and that without the proper seal, anyone could do whatever they wanted. He hoped that if the doctor slipped up, he could be expelled, or better yet, executed, so that someone else's fear could work to someone's advantage for once. Meanwhile, Luca noticed something strange. There was a thin layer of pollen on Adele's gloves, barely visible in the light. He rubbed some between his fingers and smelled bitterness. He remembered a conversation with a merchant last year who boasted that ladies in the capital smeared their skin with berry extract to make it look whiter, and that sometimes this berry caused eye pain and dizziness. He told Tessa and Oscar to take the gloves to the barn and not show them to anyone. He promised himself he would examine the box later. Good news arrived at the castle. In the distant rooms, the disease was on the decline, and the servants had stopped falling ill. Luca made everyone clean the courtyards, roll the barrels out into the sun, take out the old carpets and burn them. People grimaced at the smoke, but they slept more peacefully. Life in the city also became easier. Luca conveyed simple rules for the people through the parish clerk. Boil laundry. Do not keep the sick in a cramped corner. Do not let curious people into the house until the wound is closed. The clerk thundered from the pulpit that God loves clean hands no less than clean intentions. The people listened. Not all of them, but enough. By evening, the manager had gathered the tax collectors, elders, and a court physician who had lost face in his hall. He said that strangers could not be trusted, and that down in the suburbs, people were already whispering that Luke was performing miracles. He reminded them that miracles without the seal of the church always lead to fire, and that they needed to act while fear was still soft. He took a small bag of bones and dried grass out of the closet and said he had found it in Luke's bag. He lied, looking calm and confident, because he knew the value of the first words. The court physician nodded with relief. The elders liked to feel that order was returning. That same night, Tessa came to the barn. She brought Luca a fragment of a wax seal with a design similar to the coat of arms on his medallion, only cruder. She was walking across the courtyard when she saw Sigismund hurriedly closing a box and dropping a piece of the seal with a letter resembling a long R. Tessa picked up the fragment and hid it, because she had known since childhood that if fate had given you a thread, you had to hold on to it until the end, without fear of getting your hands waxed. Luca thanked her briefly. He made no promises and no vows. He simply placed the fragment on his little thing and noticed a strange resemblance to the carver. The same carpenter could have cut the wood in the same way. In the morning, the castle awoke to a dull rumble. People were walking towards the gate. Soldiers were standing there, and at the gate there was a table. On the table there was a bag. In the bag there were bones and herbs, and next to it was an official who claimed that it had been found in Luca's possession. He said that the poor doctor had brought the disease into the Duke's house in order to bargain for mercy later. He said that everything had turned out too well. A guy who was not from the guild had done what the masters had failed to do, and now the Duke was indebted to a stranger. He said that order was a line, and Luke was a blot. He asked for permission to hold a trial. The city froze. Rumors spread. Some shouted that Luke should be burned. Others remembered that he had saved their children and carried all the musty rubbish out of their rooms. Some said that there was nothing forbidden in bones and herbs, because herbs grow in fields, and bones are found in chickens, and in the reliquary of a saint. The Duke hesitated. He still felt the pain of sleepless nights at his daughter's bedside under his ribs, and his head was filled with anxiety about power and reputation. Luca was taken into custody. He did not cry out or defend himself. He looked at his hands as one looks at tools that can no longer be used. He thought about how often patience had saved him in life. The bailiff took his medallion and gave it to the manager, as was customary, as a sign of safekeeping. In the small tower, the smell of stone was colder than water. Luca sat down on a bench, leaned his back against the wall, and remembered his mother and the monastery courtyard. He remembered an old monk who once said that our world is held together by two simple things. The pain of others should be lighter than your own, and your bread should be more honest than yesterday's. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts kept ringing in his head. Meanwhile, a barrel for the fire was already being set up in the square. Oscar checked the ropes and iron. He did everything as usual, slowly, carefully,
with his usual concentration. He stopped when he saw Tessa climbing the steps. She brought a fragment of the seal and looked as if she were placing a candle at a closed door. Oscar realized that what they now held in their hands was not just a piece of wax, but a thread with which to pull the knot tight. Towards evening, a guest entered the city. A leather bag with tools hung from his cloak. He was a goldsmith from the borderlands, the same one who sometimes came to put new seals on the Duke's chests. He heard at the inn that an execution was being prepared at the gate and went to the square. He saw the fragment of the seal at Tessa's, looked at it as one looks at old work, and said that he knew the hand that had made this mark. He assured them that there was only one such engraver in the city, and that he usually worked for the manager, because the latter always had work for the engraver. Rumors about the goldsmith reached the castle. The Duke ordered him to be brought before him. Silence fell over the square when the door to the tower opened and Luca was led out to the people. The crowd whispered that everything would be decided today, before nightfall. The open-air court gathered everyone who breathed the city air and was not afraid to see the end.
The Duke, his courtiers, the elders of the guilds, the manager, Sigismund, the goldsmith, and the executioner Oscar stood on a high platform. Tessa stood nearby with a fragment of the seal in her palm. Luca was brought out without ropes, but also without the right to sit down. He stood straight and kept his gaze level with the horizon, as if he saw the field and not the crowd. The official repeated the story about the bag of bones and grass that he said had been found on Luca. He described how the healer had behaved in the chambers, humiliating respectable people and disturbing the peace. He said that only witchcraft could save Adele, and that such miracles always come at a price. He hinted that the price was already written on the faces of the townspeople whose children were lying in the heat. He spoke confidently, as those who rely on the fear of the crowd speak. The Duke signaled to the goldsmith. The latter rose and asked for the fragment of the seal. He looked at the knife marks and said that the seal was crudely forged after an old ducal model that had long been out of use. He added that there was only one person in the city who ordered such crude copies for his own use. The administrator, who liked to have familiar coats of arms on his letters, even if they were out of place. Sigismund smiled more cautiously than usual, but the smile remained. He said that the goldsmith had always envied his position, and that envy likes to cling to the truth. Oscar stepped forward and asked permission to recount what he had seen that night. He said he had noticed the steward near the casket. He added that he had seen him closing the gloves after Luca had ordered them to be removed. He recalled that the gloves had been removed from Adele's hands before her relief, and that the illness had subsided. He said it was a simple matter. Sometimes trouble lies in things, and it is caused not by an evil spirit, but by someone's gain.
He spoke little and simply, and his calmness made the alarm bells in people's heads ring more quietly. Luke asked for the gloves. He carefully took them out of the cloth, took a soldier's white tunic, shook the gloves over the white fabric, and everyone thought they saw dark spots on the fabric. He placed a small candle nearby and said that the spots would come to life near the heat. In a moment, barely noticeable insects crawled across the fabric. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone whistled. Someone covered their mouth with their hand, because simple truths always hit harder than complicated ones. Luke took a jar of vinegar, moistened the fabric, and the insects stood up. He said that such insects love furs and dusty chests, and that they bring disease when people live in cramped conditions. He reminded everyone that the gloves smelled of a bitter berry that irritates the skin and eyes. He said that the combination of two misfortunes makes the misfortune twice as insidious. Sigismund immediately declared that this was a trick. He said that Luke could have sprinkled dirt from his bag on the gloves in advance, and that the bag of bones proved his intentions. He demanded immediate execution. He added that the city would calm down if the fear of strangers was fed. Tessa couldn't hold back any longer and raised her hand. She said she had seen the manager return the seal to the box and that the fragment in her palm had fallen at the same time. She emphasized that Luca was in Adele's chambers at the time, and the box was in another wing. She showed the fragment to the goldsmith. He held it up to the gloves, the box, and the fragment of the seal on the letter in the manager's pocket. The marks from the chisel matched. The manager turned pale but kept his composure. An old woman in a faded headscarf pushed her way through the crowd. Her name was Lamia, and many years ago she had worked in the kitchen of the former duke. She asked permission to speak briefly.
She said she remembered the night when the duke's younger brother left the castle for the monastery, leaving a medallion with a lily and a wooden toy with a young woman in the city. She added that the steward was already serving at court at that time and did everything he could to ensure that no one remembered this woman. She said that the toy had been found by the monastery wall, along with a child, and that the child had a scar on his arm, just like Luke. The servants became agitated. The old woman turned to Luke and asked him to show the scar on his left forearm. Luke rolled up his sleeve. There was a crescent-shaped mark on his skin. The old woman nodded and cried, not out of pity, but because the circle was complete. The Duke listened as the usual order was disrupted. He looked at Luke's medallion, which the constable was already holding. He called the goldsmith and asked where the engraver was from. The latter replied that such a lily was carved only for those children whose blood was not recognized at court, but who needed a mark for the monastery register. He added that the engraver had worked for the previous duke and had died long ago. He said that this medallion was genuine and older than the current administrator. Sigismund looked away. Luca stood motionless. He was not thinking about blood or lilies. He was thinking about how Adele was breathing more evenly, and how there were still mountains of old carpets in the courtyard that needed to be burned. He understood that kinship with the ducal house was something that could ruin a simple job. He watched as the crowd sought simple support. He said he didn't need a place at the table where they argued about seals. He needed a place in the city where the poor were treated, not for money, but for conscience's sake. He asked the Duke to allow him to open a hut for the sick near the monastery. He said he was ready to teach anyone who wasn't afraid of boiling water and vinegar. The Duke was silent. He looked at the manager, at Tessa, at Oscar, at the goldsmith, at the old woman, Lamia, at Luke, who had the calm face of a man who had not come to bargain. He remembered the nights at his daughter's bedside and how the noise in her chest had subsided. He remembered how easily thin gloves stick to the skin and how difficult it is to wash away the stigma of suspicion. He said that the bag of bones was ridiculous evidence because any surgeon in any kitchen had herbs and bones. He said that the seal on the manager's letter was fake and that the forgery at the gate was an insult to the house. He said that Sigismund was no longer the manager. Sigismund asked for a trial, but not a public one, rather a court. He said that he was being set up, that his name was being used in other conversations. He added that he did not want evil, but only observed
formalities. The Duke said that formality without honesty is empty skin. He ordered Sigismund to be placed in the tower until the trial, and his letters and seals to be handed over to the goldsmith. He asked Oscar to keep order. He announced that Luca would be released and that he would be given the old bakery in the courtyard as a house for the infirmary. The people sighed. Their sigh was like the wind before rain. They saw fear flowing across the square, losing its power like water when a way out is found. Some fell to their knees, not in worship, but in relief. Some whispered that justice exists if it comes first and foremost from the choice of the people, not from miracles. Luke didn't smile broadly, but his eyes grew warmer. He took the medallion back. He approached Tessa and Oscar. He thanked them briefly and to the point. He said that without their eyes he would be standing differently today. Oscar nodded. Tessa held the fragment of the seal and thought that sometimes a small thing outweighs heavy words. In the evening, Lamia came to Luca.
She brought an old note with the name of the woman who had left the child at the monastery. Lamia said that this woman once sang in the kitchen, and her voice was smooth and kind. Luke read the name and felt water rising from deep within, water that had long stood under a rock. He did not rush. He accepted this fact as one accepts a change in the weather. Everything continues to happen, but now the meaning has become clearer. In the weeks that followed, the town saw simple rules become a new habit. Luca set up a hut near the monastery. It had plenty of light, clean water, a smokehouse for tools, and a herb dryer. He made no secret of his skills. He showed how to boil and what to rub, how to bandage and when not to interfere with nature. He took on students from different houses, the shoemaker's daughter, the miller's nephew, the innkeeper's son. He didn't ask if they had silver. He asked if they were ready to stand by when it smelled of blood and vinegar. Adele visited the infirmary. She brought dry sheets and occasionally went into the room where Luke kept his herbs. She said through the maid that she wanted to help in the weaving room and was ready to sew as many bandages as needed. Luke replied that he was grateful and that fabric loved labor as much as the earth loved water. There was no unnecessary warmth between them, but there was something that held the world together more strongly than oaths, a common cause. Meanwhile, Sigismund sat in his cell and tried to put his past in order with the help of words on paper. The goldsmith sorted through his letters and seals. Many ugly threads emerged from them: bribed officials, inflated taxes, gifts given through false accounts, embellished for appearances. The court at the court was not quick, but it was consistent. Sigismund was stripped of his position, part of his property was confiscated, and the rest was ordered to be given to a hospital. He was not executed because the Duke wanted to show that execution was not a way to quell chaos when order could be restored with a hand and a mind. Sigismund was exiled to a distant estate. There, he had to live without seals and without the staircases he loved to run up. The city learned to live without unnecessary shouting. On Monday, as before, the bells rang, and on Thursday cheese merchants came to the market. But there was more trust in simple actions in the air. A boy sat at the gate of the infirmary and wrote down who came with a wound, who with a fever, and who with a request for bandages. The rules hung on the wall, and there was not a single word about miracles. It said that cleanliness and air were important, that water had to be boiled, that being close to the sick required courage and intelligence, not shouting. One day, when the sun was as dull as a coin, Luke was sitting on the porch. Lamia approached him. She said that on the distant shore of the monastery, where the Duke's brother once lived, there were records of a man
who had accepted the world. The record said that he had a student, a boy from the suburbs, who was left alone and to whom a wooden lily was left. Luca realized that they were talking about him. He thought about how long his life had been connected to the house, which he knew only from the outside. He decided that kinship did not oblige him to live behind velvet curtains, but it did oblige him to behave in such a way that the people around him had less reason to fear. Tessa came that same day with a basket of flour. She began to teach the women how to wash bandages properly and not leave dirt in the corners. She heard people outside the infirmary gate saying that the executioner's daughter was now in charge at the hospital door. She smiled and continued her work because she didn't need to be in charge. It was enough for her to know that the knots in her hands were being untied, not tightened.
Oscar continued his work, and strangely enough, the city treated him with great respect. For the first time, people saw that discipline and precision were not cruelty, but a form of mercy. When someone asked him about that square, Oscar replied that he was only doing what he always did, making sure the ropes were strong and that the truth was too. Years passed. The infirmary grew. A bathhouse was built in the neighboring courtyard, and next to it was a small garden plot for herbs. Luca sometimes took out his medallion and wiped it with a cloth. He did not go to the castle without a purpose, but sometimes the Duke called him for advice. They discussed how to provide clean water to the low-lying neighborhoods, where swamps protruded from the ground and were visible to people. The Duke listened to Luca more attentively than his former advisers because he did not mince words. Children began to be born in the city, whose mothers stood tall. It was now easier for them to believe that a happy outcome was possible if they did not shout about miracles, but did what was necessary. People began to look differently at those below them. The cook at the castle took on an apprentice from a poor street. The blacksmith taught the widow's son how to wield a hammer. The clerk stopped scolding people for their superstitions and began to explain simple things in simple language more often. One day, a traveler returned to the city. He was from a place where the river lay wide across the rocks. He brought a bag of letters for people who were remembered here. In one letter was a tiny icon with that very lily. The letter was from a monk from a distant monastery. He wrote that before his death, the Duke's brother had asked him to convey that his student had long since found his own way. He asked him to say that kinship is not a duty to greatness, but a duty to simplicity. Luca read the letter by the window. He thought that these words knocked away the step on which pride had sat since childhood and placed another, wider one next to it. He put the icon in his pocket and went to the ward, because there was always someone waiting in the ward. By that time, the town no longer called Luke a poor doctor, but simply a master. But he continued to carry a bucket, herbs, and vinegar. He rarely spoke about himself. His deeds spoke for him. People remembered that when hail struck the roofs, he was the first to approach the widow's house and help close the hole. When vagrants fought in the market, he restrained the hotheads with cold water. When the roads were blocked in winter, he and Oscar cleared a path to the infirmary and brought firewood there. Adele once came without her entourage. She brought a small doll for the girl in the ward. She said through the maid that she often remembered that night. Luca nodded and pointed to the table where clean bandages lay. She understood that gratitude was not words, but busy hands. She sat down and helped roll new bandages, and it was clear that she had naturally unhurried fingers that did not tear the fabric. In exile, Sigismund tried to establish a new order.
where his seal would once again appear on other people's letters. But he was surrounded by people who had already heard the story about the square and the seal. They treated him with caution. He lived quietly for years. Sometimes he wrote letters to the city, complaining about his fate. The letters were filed away in the archives. They were opened in the infirmary, because the people there liked to read about other people's fates in order to better understand their own. Luca once read such a letter and realized that a person deprived of the opportunity to weave a web first judges the web and then the world. He folded the letter and gave it to Tessa because she liked to burn paper for kindling. At the end of a long spring, the city experienced its first year without severe illness in many years. People attributed this not to a miracle, but to the fact that Luca's hut worked like a watermill, quietly grinding misfortune into the dry flour of everyday solutions. Benches were set up in the square. On one of them, Oscar repaired an old step. Tessa placed a tub of water. Adele brought a basket of bandages, and Lamia sat down to rest. The Duke passed by and looked at them. He thought that power was not only walls and seals, but also the right to see how people themselves kept the city from the brink. When the sunset faded, a woman with a fever was brought to the infirmary. Luke took off her wet clothes, covered her with a clean cloth, and ordered water to be boiled. He acted as he always did, quickly and without unnecessary words. His medallion hung on the wall. It tapped quietly against the wood when the door opened. That dull sound encapsulated the entire journey, from the monastery wall to the square, from the seal on a stranger's letter to the clean water in the vats, from the cries of witchcraft to the simple rules that held the city together. By morning, the woman was breathing evenly. Luca went out onto the porch. The air was fresh, and the grass smelled like grass. He thought that every morning was a small square where they decided again who to listen to, fear or their hands. He smiled to himself and went inside, because where people breathe evenly, new work is always waiting. It so happened that the poor doctor saved the Duke's daughter, and the nobility tried to send him to the fire. It so happened that in the square people stood together and chose clarity over noise. It so happened that the truth of kinship did not stand as a shield, but as a quiet mark that did not demand honors, but only strengthened the back at the right moment. It so happened that an underestimated person became a pillar of support. And from that moment on, the city began to do simple things on time more often than loud things late. This was the justice that was enough for everyone.